You are listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide, a weekly shortwave radio program and online podcast dedicated to uncensored, politically incorrect biblical teaching. To learn more about Christian America Ministries, visit our website, christianamericaministries.org. And now the broadcast.
Greetings in the blessed holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. I'm your host, Matthew Dyer, and we are broadcasting around the world on shortwave radio and over the internet at kingdomradioonline.com, as well as our YouTube channel, Christian America Ministries on YouTube, and on Spotify and TuneIn as well as a podcast. If you're listening to us on shortwave radio this evening, we would really appreciate a reception report. If you go to our website, christianamericaministries.org, and go to the contact page, you can send in just a quick reception report and let us know how and where you're listening. And if you send us your mailing address or email, whichever one you prefer, we'll send you a free copy of one of my books in our introductory packet. And we can do that via email, or we'll send you some physical copies if that's what you want. And for those out there that listen to this program regularly, and I hear from many of you out there, if you appreciate this program, I like to remind people that and I don't do it very often, that the broadcast time that we use to broadcast on shortwave radio is listener supported. I mean, people donate directly to the radio station or directly to me, whichever you want to do. And all those donations go to broadcast time if you donate to the radio station. And right now we have a time slot on Saturday evening, every Saturday at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, and Sunday at 10 p.m. Central Standard Time on WRMI on frequency 9395. And that signal there, that station goes all around the world. So if you do appreciate and get value and benefit from this program, consider supporting if you're able. It does help out. In this program, I'm going to be actually going over some stuff that I did in a weekly sermon a few weeks ago. And a lot of people, there was an audio issue with that sermon, and a few people asked me to re-preach it. So instead of re-preaching it for our local congregation, I decided to do a radio program and go over a lot of the things that I went over in that sermon. And the sermon title was Adam Man, and we're going to be talking about Polygenesis versus Monogenesis. And that is basically, was there multiple creations of man, or was there a single Genesis of man, a mono? And we'll go over that, and we'll discuss the different creations here in a minute. If you want to go ahead and get your Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 28, and that's where we're going to start in this broadcast. And it says here, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his image, and in the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." Now, we're going to be discussing the creation of man found in Genesis chapter 1. This man was made on the sixth day of creation, as we just read, and some believe that is a literal 24-hour day, or it's figurative in some way. We won't get into that in this broadcast, although I do want to do a broadcast on that, or a sermon, here very soon, hopefully by the end of the year, on is the earth 6,000 years old, or is it much older? Those two positions is old earth creationism versus young earth creationism. But we're not going to get into that in this broadcast, but maybe perhaps another one. Now, how a person understands the creation of man, Adam man, is very important because it all is connected with our identity as who we believe we are. And if you view and believe that all the peoples of the earth came from Adam, and when I mean peoples, I mean all the different races of people came from Adam in Genesis 2, then you must believe we are not different. We're all the same in some way or another. It's just simple genetics. If you have someone, a father, and let's say he's of one race, let's say he's a white man, it's genetically impossible for that white man to turn black or Asian. Okay, it just doesn't work that way. Even though I've read some books, I read one here very recently by Clem Davies, and it's The Racial Streams of Mankind. I read that book. I'd always wanted a copy, and I found a copy of it, and I wanted to read it because he was an Anglo-Israel believer, and he was big in the 40s and 50s. And in that book, he taught that all men came from Adam, and that the descendants of Ham went into Africa, and because they lived in the region of Africa over time, because of the elevation and the severity of the sun and so forth and so on, the people in that land turned black, and the Asians moved into their area, and they turned Asian, and so forth. And that is kind of the position you have to take if you believe all men came from Adam. All races came from Adam. But it's absolutely ridiculous because we have white people in South Africa that have been there generations, and they are just as white now as they were when their ancestors arrived, unless they've mixed with the black people that live there in Africa. So we observe differences. We know and understand they exist. I mean, we understand that there's a difference between a black Aborigine and an Irishman and a Chinese man. I mean, we just understand that. We know that. Genetically, if you look into genetics, we know there's a difference. Oftentimes people say, well, the only difference is skin color. No, that's not true. There's huge differences genetically. And we won't get into that in this broadcast, but oftentimes things like that, when you say things like that, even if they're factual evidence, that's called scientific racism. Now think about that, how stupid that is. How can science or genetics be racist if it's a fact? That's Marxist propaganda is all that is. So it's a very important subject on how you believe, because the Bible doesn't. It contradicts the fact that all people are the same. It does. And I know with a lot of us out there, if we were raised in the culture that we were raised in the last 50, 100 years, everything in our body's like, oh, no, that's not right. We're all the same. Well, that's not what the Bible teaches, though. There's lots of examples where there is huge differences in racial distinctions. Look at the Canaanites and the Israelites, for example. And it's not just because they're of a different religion. That's not the only case. And we find that with, Abraham, for example. Abraham didn't want his son Isaac to marry into other peoples, other kindreds. And he was so strict on this that he made his head of his household swear to go take his son into his own kindred to get a wife. And those kindred were idolaters, by the way. A lot of people don't realize that. Rebekah and Jacob, they were grieved when Esau married outside of his own kindred. So those are just a few examples. If you want to learn more about that, I did write an article recently. It's at my website called What is Biblical Kinism? And you can go there in the blog section and read that if you'd like. That is the kind of a test chapter of a book that I'm working on that I don't know when it will be done, but it's all on that subject. So before we go on, I want to give some different points of view on creation here. Some differing points of view of the creation of man, the other peoples of the earth. And there's different ones besides what I'm going to list here. But these are, I guess you could say, the three main ones, and there's variations, of course. Number one would be that all people on the earth are descendant of Adam in Genesis chapter 2. And that Genesis chapter 1 is speaking of the same creation that is spoken in Genesis chapter 2, but Genesis chapter 2 is just going into more detail into this. And this position normally believes that the three main races came from Noah's three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And the three sons were either born of different races, so you had a white man, a black man, and an Asian, which is ridiculous, or they migrated to different parts of the earth and then changed over time. Now, that's how that position comes about. One popular belief that is completely wrong is that Ham's descendants turned black because of the curse of Canaan. And this is Talmudic teaching. This is truly Judeo-Christianity or Judaism, because it's taught in the Talmud in the Sanhedrin 108b that these people turned to black because of the curse there. And that's just completely ridiculous. And even today, that is taught. That's taught when people say that Moses married a black woman in Numbers chapter 12, where in the King James it says Ethiopian, but it is a Cushite. That the word there is for Cushite. And Cush was a descendant of Ham, and even when they say that that was a black woman, they are, and they don't even realize it, a lot of them don't, they are extending the theology that the descendants of Ham turned black because of the curse, because of that. And they don't even realize it. Now, this theological position is called Monogenesis. Mono meaning one, and Genesis meaning beginning. So one beginning of man, one beginning of the men of the world. And in my opinion, this views position on the races becoming into being through either all three sons of Noah being different races, or them just turning that way because the different places they migrated in the earth is just ridiculous. I mean, there's lots of white people in South Africa today that have not turned black. They're still as white as their ancestors were when they arrived, unless they married in with the black population. That just doesn't make any sense. The second position is that Genesis 1 is telling of the creation of all the other races, and that Genesis 2 is telling of the creation of Adamkind, which is the white race. Now, this theological position is a polygenesis, meaning multiple, poly meaning multiple, and Genesis meaning beginning, so multiple beginnings of creation. And this one here, I have issues with this one too, and I'll explain here in a minute. This is a pretty popular belief among some people, that Genesis 1 is telling of all the other people, and then Genesis 2 is the white race, the Adamkind. And I don't think that's correct as well. A third position, which is the one that I hold to, is Genesis 1 is telling of the creation of a pre-Adam Adamic people. So pre-Adam in the singular, but they are the same kindred as Adam in Genesis chapter 2. But it was a multiple creation. We don't know how many were made. And that Genesis 2 is telling of the creation of a singular Adam who was intended to be a priest of sorts, a leader of that creation in order to bring order to it. So God's kingdom. And this position would have all the other races being created in the creation story as separate creations. So blacks, Orientals, and then this Adam kind. But they were not focused upon the story because the focus was on Adam kind, Adam man. And that's not to put down the other creations, but they just weren't focused on, but they were created in that story. But Genesis 1 man was Adam man, a pre-Adamic Adam man that would be used as basically as breeding stock for Adam's children and their descendants after him. And there's several other views on this position, variations. I mean, some people believe that the different peoples came about at the Tower of Babel. Others believe that Genesis 1 and 2 is the same creation, but the other races were created still silently somewhere else, or there's different opinions. I personally hold with this third position, that Genesis chapter 1 man is the same kindred as in Adam chapter 2, in Genesis chapter 2, and that these were two separate creations, and that we really don't know how long of a time span it was between Genesis chapter 1, Adam man, and Genesis chapter 2, Adam. The text doesn't give us anything to judge time by in those, so we don't know. It could have been thousands of years. We have no idea between Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Now, some may be wondering why I believe that Genesis chapter 1 man was Adamic, an Adam kind man. And the reason for that is the English word man. in Genesis chapter 1 is the Hebrew word Adam. It's Strong's H120. It's the same Hebrew word we find in Genesis chapter 2 for singular Adam. And let me give you an example of how Genesis chapter 1 verse 27 could read. It says here, "So God created Adam kind in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them." So here for the word Adam, I inserted Adam kind, kind of like we would do mankind in this sense in the English. Because we know we're speaking of multiple Adam kind in this passage because it says male and female. Not just man as in a male, but male and female. So we're talking about a certain kindred and kind of people. So Adam kind, male and female. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And it's the same Hebrew word used in Genesis chapter 2. Now, because of this Hebrew word being used in Genesis 1 and 2, that leads some to believe this is speaking of the same creation. But I don't think that is the case, like I said. And I'll explain why in a moment. Now, when God created Adam and Eve, they would have had children. That was the plan. Adam and Eve were going to have children. Now, let me ask you a question. If you only have Adam and Eve in the world, they are the very first man and woman. Don't really even focus on race at this moment in time. But they're man and woman. Who would have their children married? Now, the most common answer you'll find in most Judeo-Christian churches that believe in monogenesis is that they married their brothers and sisters. And that we are all children of incest from the very beginning. That was God's plan from the very beginning of Genesis, is to create Adam and Eve, and that their children were going to marry in incest, and that was going to be the creation of mankind, was through incest. Because that was the plan. How else do you do it? I have a problem with this because God created this wonderful world and sets it up to work properly. And then he creates Adam and Eve and lets their children marry one another. That was part of the plan. When we know later on in God's law, he forbids this practice. Incest is forbidden. Now, think about that. Now, we know internally, I think it's God's law written on our heart, that incest is wrong, bad. It's a genetic, even among animals, it is something that is wrong. Oftentimes when you do have incest with animals, eventually you will have something where the animals, I've seen cats that were born of incest, and the mothers leave the kittens because there's something wrong with them. And you can observe a white-tailed deer. If a doe has a buck, before that buck gets ready to go into rut and possibly mate with its mother, the mother will chase it off. So we know that incest is wrong. Most animals know that it's wrong. It's morally wrong. And I've preached on it before in messages on how God's law, his moral laws, as we call them, not that other laws of God are not moral, but that's what we call them, the rights and the wrongs, were in place long before Moses. And I believe that would include incest. I mean, think about it. I mean, I would think that in people's, in their gut, they would think that God would have a better plan than having brothers and sisters marry one another. But because of the narrative, in the way they've been taught, they don't go outside that. Now, I've heard other theories that, it was all right back then, marrying brothers and sisters, because the genetics were pure and things like that. They try to explain it away. But if you research any type of brothers and sisters marrying one another, it's never good. And the more you do it, the worse it gets. Genetically, you may be able to get away with it once, and there not be too big of genetic issues, but you do it generation after generation after generation after generation, you're going to have genetic issues. Now, if you believe, this is another thing, if you believe the sin of Ham in Genesis chapter 9 was the sin of incest, that Canaan was the product of that incest, was cursed because of that incest. Now, this makes monogenesis view even more strange, because now we're all product of incest, and Why was Canaan cursed for it? Now, that's a whole other message in itself, but if you know what I'm talking about, if you believe that Ham's sin was incest and Canaan was the product of incest, why did God curse Canaan when everyone was a product of incest? Now, what I believe is we have Genesis 1, is the creation of Adamkind as a whole, and then perhaps very soon or very long after, you have the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And then this Adam was meant to be the one to bring things into order in God's kingdom on earth and be God's ambassador before the fall, of course. This would mean that Adamkind that were created in Genesis 1 would be breeding stock, so to speak, for the Adam and Eve's descendants that we see in the Garden of Eden. There would have been people like themselves already in existence so that they would not be forced to commit the sin of incest. It is a sin. It's a transgression of God's law. It's a transgression of genetic law at the very beginning. So let me show you some evidence to this. That's what I believe. Let me show you some evidence on why I believe this. Go to Genesis chapter 4, verse 9 through 16. Genesis chapter 4, 9 through 16, which is right after Cain murdered his brother, where it says this. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground, and now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand? When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out from this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any find him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. So, I hope that you can hear a few issues with this passage if you believe that there was no other mankind in the earth at this time. Who was Cain afraid of? Think about it. Who was Cain afraid of? Everything here in this passage would mean absolutely nothing unless there was other people in the world that he could be afraid of. Now, your most common answer to this was, well, it was his brothers and sisters. Now, the issue with that is at this moment in time, there's only Adam and Eve and Cain because he just killed his brother Abel. So if Adam and Eve were the only ones alive, what need would there be for a mark unless there were other people in the earth? Adam and Eve would know what their son looked like. Let's say that there's some unnamed brothers and sisters here, which there are not any evidence in the text to believe that. They would know what their brother looked like. I mean, how many other people are running around as a fugitive separate from the clan, so to speak? Now let's look at verse 17, next verse in that passage, which says this. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. End quote. Now, ask yourself this. Where did Cain find this wife of his? And why in the world is he building a city? Now, right after this, he left. We don't know how long. Let's say it's 50 years. Adam and Eve had some more children. You know, the answer that would be given was, well, he married his sister. Well, when he leaves and is outcast and goes into the land of Nod, right then and there, it's him and his mom and dad. So there has to be time for them to have more children for him to commit incest with. And then he's building this city. But there's nothing in the text that says there's more people at this moment in time that are related to Adam and Eve. Any brothers and sisters? So it only makes sense that there was other people in the world at that moment in time for him to go take a wife of and know her. And she conceived and bare a son, Enoch. And then there was people there enough to build a city. Now you could have a farm full of people. I mean, let's say you had 30 people on a farm. Is that enough to build a city? I mean, is there enough justification to build a city, have trade and work and things like that? Not hardly. But obviously, there was people here enough that he went in and built a city and was the ruler of it, and obviously was a leader there of the people. And like I said, the most common answer you'll find here is that he married one of his sisters or a niece, or did so before leaving the land of Nod or something like that. But the text doesn't say that. It implies that there is only 3 people on the earth if you don't believe that there's other people that were created before Adam and Eve. The only good answer is there were people in the land already that were of the same kindred as Adam kind, and from other creations. This view prevents incest between brothers and sisters. This view answers where Cain got his wife. This view answers who Cain was afraid of. And it answers who he built a city for. And it answers who Seth was going to marry as well. You don't have the father of mankind, so to speak, or Adam kind through Adam and then Seth marrying a sister, which is disgusting and against God's law. So that is my position on why there has to be some kind of other creation of Adam kind before that was a separate creation of the same kindred as Adam, and that the other races were created in the same Genesis chapter 1 story. They just weren't focused upon. Adam kind was the focus. And that's a Hebrewic tradition in writing, is they're focusing on one party. You see this with Abraham after his descendants. The focus through after have Adam kind, Adam to Abraham, and then Abraham to present, you have the Israelites being focused upon. They're not talking about Chinese culture or Chinese history. Now, it's an unpopular, politically incorrect belief, but the Bible is written about the Adamic, Abrahamic people. I mean, that's the focus, and not just the Abrahamic people, but also through Isaac and Jacob and Israel, the Israelites. Any other people really focused on are other people that came in contact with the Israelites after Genesis chapter 17. So with that being said, what about the race of Adam kind? I mean, how do we know that Adam was a white man? Maybe he was a black man or yellow or whatever. I mean, how do we know what race he was? The races were created separately, which is something that I believe. When God created Adam, what kindred was he of? And the first clue to this we have is in in the Hebrew word for Adam, which means to be ruddy, or to show blood in the face, or to blush, to actually blush and show blood. Now, this trait is a Caucasian trait. You only find this in Caucasian people, where it is prevalent, where you can actually see it and present. And it's a genetic fact that this is the case. And I want to read out a book here written by William C. Boyd. The title of the book is Races of People, from 1955 to 1955 is when it was published. On page 43 and 45, it says this, quote, "The color of normal human skin is due to the presence of 3 kinds of colored chemicals, or pigments. The most important of these pigments is melanin, a dark brown substance. The second of the 3 pigments is carotene. This is a yellow substance which is present in carrots, from which it gets its name, and egg yolks, as well as human skin. The third pigment is hemoglobin, which is the red coloring matter of blood. The hemoglobin occurs in the blood vessels beneath the skin so that very little can show through. The presence of fair amount of either melanin or carotene in the skin covers it up completely. The hemoglobin does show up, however, in the skin of white men, particularly in those of the light complexion. It is the hemoglobin that accounts for the pink cheeks and the ability to blush. On the basis of these differences in coloring, mankind is sometimes divided into a, quote, black race, high in melanin, a, quote, yellow race, low in melanin but high in carotene, and a, quote, white race, low in both melanin and carotene, end quote, from that book, Races of People by William C. Boyd. Now, he's just establishing genetic fact that it is white people that can blush. They can blush most prominently. And the Hebrew word here for Adam means to show blood in the face, to be able to blush. And the Hebrew word here, Adam, is Strong's number 119 through 124. For some reason, Strong's took one Hebrew word and he numbered it and classified it differently, but 119 through 124. But it's all the same Hebrew word. The Hebrew word Adonai is derived from this word, which is Strong's 132. And let me give you examples of how this word is used. It's very closely related and linked to Adam, and it's often described as being translated in English as someone that is ruddy and red, be able to show blood in the face, or often fair-haired, all traits of white people. And I want to read 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 12, speaking of David, who was one of Adam's descendants. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 12 says this, "And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and withal of beautiful countenance, and goodly to look at. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he." End quote. Now, he's being described as ruddy. Now, the commenter, Adam Clarke, in his commentary, says this on this verse here, concerning the word ruddy. Quote, "He was ruddy. I believe the word here means red-haired. He had golden locks. Hair of this kind is ever associated with a delicate skin and a florid complexion." End quote. So even Adam Clarke, the famous commentator here, is acknowledging that David is being described as a white man. He's saying it means either he had red hair and golden locks, and that people that had this kind of hair is associated with delicate or fair skin. Matthew Poole, another famous commentator, says this concerning this verse and concerning ruddy. Quote, "He was ruddy, which may be referred either to the color of his hair or rather to the complexion of his skin, of his face." Now, I don't think anyone can argue that right there he's describing a white man. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 42, it says this concerning David as well. Quote, "When the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of fair countenance." End quote. Now, in this passage here, the Philistine, Goliath, he saw David, he disdained him, and he was mocking him because of his youth. He was mocking him because he was ruddy, and he was mocking him because of his fair countenance. Why would you mock somebody if you were fair, and ruddy, and young as well? So obviously he wasn't young, we know that, Goliath, but David was. And the way he's talking would insinuate that Goliath wasn't ruddy and fair either, of a different people, which the Philistines were. There is a documentary that I would recommend that you all get a hold of, at least watch it one time. It's called The Patterns of Evidence Exodus. And it's fairly new, past couple years. And in that documentary, now there's a lot of leaven in there, a lot of things in there that just I disagree with, a lot of Jewishness. And if you can kind of get past all that, in that documentary, they show some very compelling evidence that Joseph, son of Jacob, was a white man with red hair, which would line up with the appearance of David found in Scripture, because they're of the same people. And there's even a statue that they find over there in Egypt that they believe is of Joseph. It was a fair-haired, fair-skinned fellow with red hair and a multicolored tunic who was not an Egyptian, but was a high Egyptian official. He wasn't of Egyptian descent. And they think they even found his palace over there. And there was 12 tombs outside of the palace. And that the biggest tomb was a pyramid tomb. And that's where they found this statue. And inside this tomb, there was no bones, which, if you remember from the story of Joseph, the Israelites took his bones back to Israel, so the land of Israel, when they left, so they wouldn't have been there. So I'd recommend you get a hold of that, just some more evidence to what I'm saying here. And it's a pretty well popular documentary out there. You can watch it. I think you can rent it on YouTube, maybe. If not, you can search it and find it online and order the DVD. Another scripture to lend to this is Lamentations chapter 4, verse 7, if you want to go over and turn there, where it says here, speaking of the Nazarites, a Nazarite woman, her Nazarites were purer than snow. They were whiter than milk. They were more ruddy in body than rubies. Their polishing was of sapphire. End quote. Now in this passage, they are described as white, these Nazarites. They're white, and the word ruddy is used here, which is the word Hebrew word Adam. And Adam Clarke, in his commentary on this verse agrees that it is speaking of skin color here. He says this, quote, milk will most certainly well apply to the whiteness of the skin, the beautiful rubies to the ruddiness of the flesh, and the sapphire in its clear transcendent purple to the veins in its complexion. The reverse of this state, as described in the following verse, needs no explanation. The face was dismal, dark brown, the flesh gone, the skin shriveled, and apparently wrapped around the bones. End quote. Now, what he's speaking about the next verse is in verse 8, where it's contrasting what was said in verse 7. It says here, their visage is blacker than a coal. They are not known in the streets. Their skin cleaveth to their bones. It is withered. It is become like a stick. End quote. So we have in verse 7 here, we have this Nazarite being spoken about as being whiter than milk and more ruddy, fair complexion, show blood in the face, in body, than rubies. And then the polishing was of sapphire. Now, sapphire are blue. And if you look at a white man's skin, you see the blue. If you look in your arms, the blue veins, because the blood isn't oxidized. It's blue or purple, like a sapphire. And I think that's what it's speaking of. And Adam Clarke seems to think the same as well when it talks about in the veins in a fine complexion. Now, in verse 8, it talks about someone that they turned black. They turned dark, you could say. They were out in the streets. They were out in the elements. Their skin cleaved to their bones. They're obviously hungry. It's withering. They became like a stick. Now, in the Greek Septuagint in this passage, it renders it a little differently, which I think makes it a little clearer. In the Brenton Septuagint, it says this, their countenance is become blacker than smoke. They are not known in the streets. Their skin was cleaved to their bones. They are withered. They are become like a stick. End quote. Now, a black man cannot become black. But a white person, if they are out in the sun, in the elements, out in the streets, as it's saying here, they will become very dark. Basically, their skin is baking. Now, it's not as black and dark as a white man, and it's not changing their genetics, but you get a tan. I remember growing up, knowing a few men that spent a lot of time out in the fields working and planting back in Kentucky. They spent a lot of time working out in the sunlight. And they'd take off their shirt and they'd have a farmer's tan, and they were white as snow underneath, but their arms look like a Mexican. Very dark. And that's because they were out in the streets in the context of this passage. They were out in the elements. This person here was out in the elements. Their countenance has become darker than smoke. They are not known in the streets. Their skin has cleaved to their bones because they're hungry. They're withering. Now this is speaking of someone who falls from their position and becomes this way, which I believe is referring to, like I said, the sun being burnt, because this is the only way a person that is white becomes dark and that isn't dark already, as they become that way from the elements. Now, another example of this is in the Songs of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 10, which is describing Solomon as being white and ruddy. Let's turn to Solomon chapter 5, verse 10. It says here, speaking of Solomon, "My beloved is white and ruddy, the chiefest among 10,000." End quote. The Britain Septuagint renders it this way: "My kinsman is white and ruddy, chosen out from midrets." So Solomon, think about it here. Solomon was a direct ancestor of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and we have his father, David. They were Adamites. Now, David was a direct descendant of Jesus. And we know that Jesus was a pure Israelite. So it would not be unreasonable to say that Jesus was a kinsman of the flesh of David and had an appearance physically that was white and ruddy like David, like his son Solomon. But today, how many of us here, people say, well, I'm not racist. I worship a brown Middle Eastern Jew. Now we hear that, and many people say, well, that doesn't mean anything. But once you say that Jesus is a white man, people lose it. And oftentimes Europeans are accused falsely of whitewashing Jesus in the Middle Ages. They accuse white Europeans of taking Jesus, they'd say he's a brown Middle Eastern man, and whitewashing him into a white man when he really should be brown. But here in the Scriptures, in the Holy Scriptures, we have David being described as a white and ruddy individual. We have Solomon being described as a white and ruddy individual. And Jesus is a descendant of them, pure. Why would we not think that Jesus was a white and ruddy individual when the Scripture says that his ancestors were? Simple as that. But a lot of people, they look at the brown Middle Eastern people of 2024, they look at them, and they say, well, that must be what Jesus looked like 2,000 years ago, or that must have been what David looked like, or Solomon. But let me ask you this. In America today, take somewhere like, I don't know, Kentucky, in the cities. I'm from Kentucky originally. And it's a pretty white area. You know, there's a lot of white people there. But in the last 10 years, it has gotten darker by different people migrating in. Different people of different races, blacks in the cities. You know, when I lived in eastern Kentucky, we lived in a county that was 99.9% Caucasian. And I think that one point was I think there was a black man down in town that was a preacher at one of the churches, and I think that may have been the only one I remember in the entire county. And I remember living out there, a very rural community, and the churches were busing black people in from the cities and bringing them into the community within a few years. So my point with making that is demographics change over time. People migrate over time. And you look at Texas, for example, in the past, 20 years. How many more Mexicans have moved in there versus how many white people were there 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago? And actually, the immigration issue in America today is a good example of that. Look at how many thousands of people, tens of thousands of Mexicans and other people are coming into what used to be a mainly white country. The demographics are changing in a short amount of time. So looking over to the Middle East and saying all the Middle Eastern people over there have been brown like they are today for the last 2,000 years is absolutely foolish. Look at England and Ireland, Scotland. How many Muslims are coming in there just in the past decade or so and flooding that country? Look at America. How many Muslims are coming into this country and bringing in their identity, their culture, their people? And it's changed. If you look at the African slave trade and how people were bringing black people over to America, because of that migration over here, how they brought those people over here, it changed the demographics in a short amount of time. So my point in saying that is demographics change. It's foolish to say that an area has only been one race for forever, when we know that things change and people migrate over time. So it only makes sense when we look at all these verses that Jesus would have been a Caucasian, white, ruddy individual from the line of David, from the line of Solomon. And I know many people out there listening are going to be like, well, that's politically incorrect. Well, yeah, it is in our current culture. But our forefathers not very long ago believed this. They believed David was a white man, Solomon was a white man, Jesus was a white man. And only recently, when white people have been encouraged to hate their own people, that things like this have changed. You look at the early art of David, like the marble statue of David that Michelangelo did. He's a very European, ruddy, fair-haired looking individual. You can look it up. Why would Michelangelo depict David like that? I don't know. Maybe because in the Bible, David is described as a ruddy, fair-haired, fair-skinned, complected individual. And both Adam Clarke and Matthew Poole and other commenters like that, men much smarter than I, agreed with that. And then you have Solomon being described the same exact way, white and ruddy in the King James. In the Britain, white and ruddy. Very clear language. So nobody's trying to whitewash history. Actually, the opposite is happening. People are trying to darken white history. Now, just as an example of how this is going on, it's a little off topic, but not too much, because white people are being accused of whitewashing history, like with Jesus, but rather the fact we're having a brown washing of history. Look at what they're doing today with some of the movies that they're coming out. I just read this past week about some Viking show or movie on, I think it's Netflix or Amazon or something like that they're making, that they are portraying this Viking, Gerald Hakon or something like that. He was a Viking king over there in Norway in the 900s. They're portraying him in this TV show as a black woman. A Viking king in Norway in the 900s AD as a black woman. Now, people who do these movies, they've always taken some liberties, artistic liberties, when they're doing these historical movies. And I understand that they have to a certain degree, because they may be making a movie on something that there's only, a few lines in the entire movie, or entire story, on what they're pulling from. Think of the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. They're only pulling from a few pages in the Bible from that movie, so there's some artistic liberty there. But when you go as far to make a Viking movie and make the Viking king a black woman, to me that is very deliberate blackwashing of history. And that's what they're accusing white people of doing, whitewashing history. But like I've just showed you, David, Solomon, Jesus are, we have evidence in Scripture that they were fair, complected, ruddy, fair-haired individuals. So I hope in that broadcast that gave you enough to want to dig into it a little bit more. Maybe it raised some questions. Maybe it answered a few of them. I do want to give some books, though, for you to, just some recommendations if you want to dig into this in much more detail than I did in this broadcast. There's so much more that can be said. The first one I'd recommend is The Origins of Race and Civilization by Charles A. Wiseman. Now, this book is out of print, but you can find PDF copies of it online. You can also go to tearingdownidols.com, and Paul Matergene is currently putting this book into an audiobook. And I don't think he has it done yet, but I know he has a couple chapters up. And you can listen to it for free in a very professional audiobook. Now, Charles Wiseman also has another book that I would recommend in this line of thinking, and that would be Not of One Blood, which is a rebuttal to Ken Ham's book, One Blood. I believe that's the name of it. Now, this book is out of print, I believe, still as well. You still may be able to find a copy. But you can go to tearingdownidols.com as well, and Paul Matergene has an audiobook that he has already completed. I think he did it last year on this book. Listen to it all there for free. and it'd be supplementary on this topic. Another good book by Charles Wiseman would be The Facts and Fictions Regarding Noah's Flood, which isn't directly related to this, but it is connected. And you can actually go to my website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org, and on the bottom of my book page, you can read it for free. It's a PDF there. You can click on it. I got a few other books there as well. When I find books that I think will be helpful to people, I put them there on that page. Been doing that recently. Another one you can get. Now, this book is out of print, but he wrote a newer one with basically all the information in it. It's Did All Races Come from Adam by Lawrence Blanchard, Breaking the Code of Silence. This book is really good. It goes into much more detail than what I did in this broadcast. It is out of print, but you can get his Biblical Heritage series, or also his Bible Mastery Boot Camp, which is the Bible course that goes along with it. But book number 3 is pretty much this book, but expanded upon. He put more information in it. So I'd recommend those books if you want to further this subject. So I hope that the things in this broadcast were helpful to you, enlightening. I hope anyone out there that wants to dig into it more can now at least have a little bit of foundation to look into, monogenesis versus polygenesis and the creation of the different people, and how it just makes sense that there was more than one creation in Genesis. That way you don't have brothers and sisters marrying one another, and that God created his beautiful, wonderful world to begin in incest, which he later made it known that he was against, and that we know genetically is a bad idea. And it just makes much more sense when you have Adam kind being created in Genesis 1, which is basically a breeding stock for Adam and Eve's children. That way they have someone to marry. And that answers the question that where Cain got his wife, who he built a city for, who he was afraid of, and so forth and so on. For those out there listening on Shortwave Radio, we would love to hear from you. Those reception reports you send in help out a great deal. It lets us know who's listening out there in radio world, and unlike online, we don't have analytics to look at and see where we can focus our resources. So I'd recommend you go to our website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org, and send us a reception report. And if you send us your either email address or mailing address, we'll send you a free gift of one of my books, free of charge, just as a thank you for taking the time to do that. Anyway, thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries. Come back next week for another broadcast. I'm going to close out this hour with a little bit of music. So, thank you for listening.
When the British armies came from across the bounding main to attack our native shores in their sailing ships of war to establish tyranny by the orders of a tyrant king, Paul Revere cried his alarms, and the people took up arms, and they fired up their guns in the Greens and Lexington. Soon the battles would be won, and the bells of liberty would ring. Those men who fought to keep us free were not afraid to die. They drew their strength and courage from his power upon high, and cried this battle cry: no king, no king, no king but King Jesus, the Messiah. In the last 100 years we have fainted from the fight for his liberty and light. We've been blinded by the lies, so we hardly know what's right from wrong. As the anti-Christian hordes and their global overlords now surround his holy saints in the camp United States, just like Israel of old, we now find ourselves in Babylon. So now's the time for all good men to seek his face on high, and bow to do his will on earth, and rise up and defy the lie, and cry this battle cry: no king, no king, no king but King Jesus, the Messiah. No king, no king, no king but King Jesus, the Holy One of Israel, the Holy One of Israel. So now's the time for all good men to seek his face on high, and bow to do his will on earth, and rise up and defy the lie, and cry this battle cry: no king, no king, no king but Jesus, the Messiah. No king, no king, no king but Yehoshua, the Holy One of Israel, the Holy One of Israel, the Holy One of Israel.
Like a homestead abandoned, choking with weeds, your heart is a wasteland, brother, it needs prayer like a wildfire, out of control. Prayer like a wildfire, scorching your soul. Prayer like a wildfire, lighting the dark. Prayer like a wildfire, pray for its spark. Like a great hero sunken deep in a trance, now your country has only one final chance. Prayer like a wildfire, out of control. Prayer like a wildfire, scorching your soul. Prayer like a wildfire, lighting the dark. Prayer like a wildfire, pray for its spark. Unchain our nation, shatter the spell, hurl the enchanter deep into hell. Prayer is our ancient power restored. Prayer like a wildfire kindles our Lord. Prayer like a wildfire, out of control. Prayer like a wildfire, scorching your soul. Prayer like a wildfire, lighting the dark. Prayer like a wildfire, pray for its spark.
A little bird am I, shed from the fields of air, and in my cage I sit and sing to him who placed me there. Well pleased a prisoner to be, because my God, it pleases thee. Not have I else to do but sing the whole day long to him whom I most love to please, doth wish to listen to my song. He caught and bound my wandering wing.
Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries. If you are blessed by this outreach ministry, please consider going to www.christianamericaministries.org to our contact page and donating to our radio ministry to help keep this program on the air. We appreciate your support.